Nations around the Pacific held their breath on Tuesday after a massive earthquake in the far east of Russia triggered a whole load of tsunami warnings. The situation looks like it might not be as bad as people feared, but we'll get the latest on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and we're going to focus today's episode on one big global news story because it's affected a huge chunk of the planet, and it is the effects of this massive earthquake which hit on Monday night in the far east of Russia and the Kamchatka Peninsula. It was an 8.8 magnitude earthquake, making it one of the biggest quakes since modern records began at the start of the 20th century. This triggered a whole load of tsunami warnings in various nations around the Pacific, as far as the west coast of the USA. But as we're recording this episode of Newscast on Tuesday afternoon, it looks like lots of those warnings have been downgraded. But let's chat about the quake and the possible implications. And there's also some breaking news about a volcanic eruption now in the far east of Russia. And we can do that with the BBC's science correspondent, Victoria Gill, who joins us down the line. Hello, Victoria.
Hello, Adam. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And here in the studio with me is Dr. Rebecca Bell, who's Associate Professor in Tectonics at Imperial College London. Hello, Dr. Bell.
Hello, thank you for inviting me in.
And thanks for coming in. And of course, tectonics is the study of earthquakes.
It is, yes.
Victoria, how did this story start playing out for you?
With a very early text message from a panicked news editor, but probably not as panicked as the people in Japan and Hawaii who were across the ocean from this particular event. We had an event in the early hours of the morning local time that was off the coast of Kamchatka. Rebecca will know a lot more about this than me, but we have a global network of seismometers now, so you really get very swift information about the size of these events. This was an event that happened, an earthquake that happened along a plate boundary where two plates are moving towards each other and one is subducting or sinking underneath the other. And you call this type of event a megathrust earthquake. So these subduction events, because those plates get stuck together for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, when they release all of that energy very suddenly, that's your earthquake. And these tend to be very large earthquakes. So this is one of the biggest that we've had. And the danger with this is that these are the types of earthquakes when they happen under the sea that trigger these huge waves. They just move a huge volume of ocean water, and that can trigger a wave that heads towards coastlines thousands of miles away. So even though the epicenter is in a remote region in the far east of Russia, alerts went out to people of Japan and Hawaii and the coasts of the US and South America.
And Rebecca, is there anything else about the nature of the earthquake that has an impact in the physical world?
Yeah, so I believe it's been rated at the moment the sixth largest earthquake since modern records began. So the dawn of kind of modern seismology was 1900. That's when we first began recording earthquakes on seismometers, so actually having scientific measurements of earthquakes. We have information about earthquakes before that, but just from historical records. So being the sixth largest, that's a pretty big deal. In the 60s, there were a few kind of magnitude 9s and greater. Then there was quite a big gap. And I think people kind of lost a little bit of the, sense of what these earthquakes can do. And then, of course, in 2004, we had the wake-up call with the Sumatra Andaman megathrust earthquake and that devastating tsunami. We didn't wait long.
So the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was the same type of quake?
Absolutely.
Right.
So all of these top 6 earthquakes are megathrust earthquakes. And the reason they're in the top 6 is because there's a fault line big enough to host an earthquake of that size. So in order to have an earthquake of that size, you need a fault that's hundreds of kilometers, if not thousands of kilometers long. And it's, capable of rupturing kind of downwards by, 100 kilometers or more.
100 kilometers.
So we need faults that big to host these events. And as Victoria explained, the only place on Earth that we can have faults that large are at subduction zones, where a dense oceanic plate subducts beneath another plate.
And so, Rebecca, we don't use the Richter scale anymore.
No, so that was the kind of first scale that came along and was popular in the 30s and 40s. The Richter scale measures the amplitude of shaking at a fixed distance away from the epicenter on a particular seismometer. So it's quite specific. And for very large earthquakes, the scale saturates. It's just not designed to measure earthquakes that big. So if you have an seismometer pretty close to an epicenter, the shaking is going to be so much it saturates and we can't properly record it. So a more modern scale, which we use, is the moment magnitude scale. So very simply, it's a scale related to the area of the fault that slips. I mentioned these megathrust faults in large earthquakes rupture for hundreds of kilometers along the subduction zone, and can be hundreds of kilometers down the subduction zone as well. It's related to the area of the fault that slips, but also by how much the plates slip. So, that's, if you've got two plates coming towards each other, it's how much one moves over the other. And in geology, we often get, used to thinking about things in terms of millimeters per year or centimeters per year. That's the speed that tectonic plates usually move. But in an earthquake like the 2011 Japan earthquake, the plates moved by 52 meters, which is massive.
Yeah.
In today's event, it looks from the USGS website that the maximum slip's being
That's the US Geological Society.
It is, yeah, or the US United States Geological Survey.
Geological Survey, yes.
So it's put the slip at between 8 and 10 meters maximum. So the 2011 Japan earthquake was really special in that the amount of slip was huge, and that slip also reached to very shallow depths, which has an impact on the tsunami.
So that headline magnitude number that we get, which in this case was 8.8, that's a sort of cumulative measure of various factors.
It's a much better measure of the energy released in the earthquake, whereas the Richter scale measures the amplitude of shaking. The moment magnitude scale is a better indicator of the energy released. And the huge events like the magnitude 9s, the amount of energy they release compared to a magnitude 8 even is completely different. So because everyone's so familiar with the Richter scale and everyone's got really used to it, most people know it's a logarithmic scale. So every point you go up on the scale, the amplitude of shaking increases by a factor of 10.
It's not linear.
It's not linear. When we calculate moment magnitude, we kind of try to keep a similar scale, because otherwise the public and journalists won't, have a clue what we're talking about. So generally a moment magnitude's, 5 is roughly equivalent to a Richter magnitude 5, but the moment magnitude is a much more reliable measure of energy release. And for every point you go up on the scale, the amount of energy released increases by a factor of 32.
Right. Okay.
So magnitude 9 is so much bigger, 32 times bigger than a magnitude 8.
Right. And Victoria, it seems, okay, we're recording this at 2:15 UK time, so we're like quite a good few hours after the initial quake, that the damage in the far east of Russia seems quite minimal.
It does, fortunately, and it seems like the resulting wave has been less damaging and smaller than was feared, and that might be the case that we now have, in comparison with what happened in 2004. We had the Boxing Day tsunami that hit places like Thailand with no warning at all. We now have this very interconnected network that's linked to all of these seismometers, that's linked to a global network of warning systems. So people get, although those tsunami waves travel very fast, people can have hours of warning and get to higher ground. So it really shows, that there's a good news part of this story, that it really shows that alert network and all of that kind of data, like live information gathering, is really working.
And as we're recording this episode of Newscast on Wednesday afternoon, the tsunami warnings that were in place in Hawaii and Japan have been downgraded. But I thought I'd catch up with our Tokyo correspondent, Shaimaa Khalil, to just get a bit of a sit rep for how things have felt in Tokyo and across Japan throughout Tuesday. Hello, Shaimaa.
Hey, how you doing, Adam?
Very well, thank you. Good to catch up. So, first of all, asking you as a Japanese resident rather than just a Japan correspondent, how did you first become aware that there was something heading your way?
I was woken up to an alert on my phone. It was an advisory in the beginning of the day that a huge earthquake had hit Russia and the Russian Far East, and that more developments are coming, but that a tsunami advisory has been issued in Japan's coastal areas in the Pacific coast. And within the time I'd gotten out of bed, got dressed, and went out to get to the office, it was upgraded to a warning. And the warning covered a huge swathe of that Pacific coast from Hokkaido in the northeast all the way down to Wakayama Prefecture in the south. It has been downgraded now to an advisory, but all in all, it's been a very tense day here in Japan, especially for the residents and the people in that Pacific coast area. I think these warnings and the advisory, the evacuation advisory affected around 1.9 million people.
And so did people evacuate? Did we see people getting into their cars and heading away?
That's right. Earlier in the day, you saw beaches that have been abandoned. Remember, this is the height of summer. It's school holidays. You know, a few days before that, there was talk about the heat wave, about families taking refuge in the beaches to try and deal with the heat. But we'd seen pictures today of beaches completely abandoned. Some of them closed by beach walls, and many people taking to higher ground, whether it was hilly areas overlooking beach areas or people going on rooftops, but also some stuck in gridlocks in traffic jams trying to get to higher ground. Some people, you know, one woman was saying to local media, I work near the sea and I got the alert and my boss just said, you know, just go home and be with your kids. A lot of people were also expressing surprise, even though this is a country, of course, that it's on the Pacific, ring of fire. We're used to getting these alerts, the tsunami alerts and the earthquake alerts. But I think it's the fact that this covered such a huge area, but it was also in the aftermath of a huge and shallow earthquake in Russia's Far East.
And where do people tend to head towards when they're evacuating? Like, are there shelters? Are there defined places to go?
In this case, the higher the better. And so we've seen, for example, people gather in their local areas. It depends on the local area, right? Because again, this is such a large part of the Pacific coast. So we've seen some people gather in their local observatory, for example. So it's a higher ground overlooking the beach area. Others have gone into a town hall building, gathered there, hopefully getting some air-conditioned rooms. Others on rooftops, and many really have been in their cars. They got in their cars and they went as high as they could, because again, the main thing is to evacuate low-lying areas, evacuate the beach areas, because throughout the day we've had dozens of waves hit the Japanese Pacific coast, some as high as 1.3 meters. But with these warnings that have come, people were asked to remain vigilant. They were told that, you know, some of these waves could be as high as 3 meters. And so the authorities have really been hammering it in. Go as high as you can, remain on high alert. I will say one point of concern, I feel, and this always happens when you get warnings in the Fukushima area specifically, because it's such a sensitive area, if you will, because it comes with the echoes of that triple disaster of 2011. So when you get a tsunami warning in the Fukushima area, that kind of triggers a heightened sense of concern. And we did hear from the operating company of the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. They were one of the first organizations to update the media, and they were saying that all workers were evacuated as a matter of precaution, but also that no abnormalities were reported. But I also think that it always remains an area of concern, because even after all of those years, you still have radioactive debris at the bottom of these plants. They're constantly being cooled by huge amounts of water that then get stored near the plant. So as a matter of practice, these areas are always kept as safe as possible, as isolated as possible.
And did the country as a whole learn any lessons from that 2011 quake and tsunami that means that they react better to it now?
Much faster, and the updates are much more regular. Again, this is a country that has one of the most sophisticated warning and alert systems, disaster alert systems in the world, really. And again, people get woken up, and they either get woken up by alerts on their phones or actual sirens that sound in their areas or sound on the phones, depending on how big the scale is of the disaster, whether it's the earthquake or tsunami. And as I was throughout the day, in the many hours I've been on air throughout the day, the warnings and the alerts have just kept coming, and they would have been more intense for the people closer to the areas. So yes, I think, after 2011, there have been so many measures put in place to kind of upgrade and make those alert systems, more updated, more sophisticated, and also just as fast as possible to people, to give them the most updated information so they can act on it.
And are people sort of alive to aftershocks?
I think that's the main concern now is what happens after that big earthquake. The Russian authorities have said that there could be a risk of aftershocks, and aftershocks in Russia's Far East means that there could be waves that could travel within the Pacific and within the Japan Pacific coast. I think the advisory now means that people can breathe a little bit easier, but that they should remain vigilant. That this is not a kind of a red warning, which is what we've had. But there is possibility of movement because the situation is fluid on the Russian Pacific coast. So people, I think, will still be attached to their phones, will still be looking at updates about what the waves are doing, how far they're traveling, and how big they are hitting the coast.
Shaimaa, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Adam. Good to see you.
So that was Shaimaa's sitrep in Japan, which I recorded just before we recorded the rest of this episode of Newscast. I know Victoria's got a question for you, Rebecca, but just before I go to her, what do we know about how tsunamis actually work?
So, in order to have a tsunami, you need to have some kind of disruption of the seabed. So if the seabed moves, it moves the water column above it. And remember, the subduction zones where we're talking about, many of them can be under many kilometres of water. Some of the, subduction zone trenches are the deepest parts of the Earth's ocean. There's a lot of water here above these megathrust faults. So if you do have an earthquake which ruptures very shallow depths, some earthquakes may even rupture completely to the seabed. That means that the overriding plate and any relief, any seabed relief on it will also get moved. So the movement...
Relief as in like...
lumps and bumps.
Mountains under
exactly.
the sea.
Lumps and bumps on the seabed. When those get moved, they disrupt the water column above it, and then that kind of collapse of water then creates our tsunami waves, which will propagate, in all directions, a bit like dropping a stone in a pond. It's not just a single wave, right? It's a kind of ripple effect, like dropping a rock in a pond.
And does a tsunami wave, when it hits land, look like it does in the films, or is it more kind of complicated than that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can actually see the sea regressing away from the shore. That's...
Oh, yeah, so the tide goes out quite dramatically.
Yeah, so in the 2004 Sumatra Andaman earthquake, there were reports of people going out because fish were exposed, and that was one reason why so many people were killed in that event. So the sea can recede before the tsunami wave comes in. That doesn't always have to happen. It kind of depends on whether the seabed movements are related to a drop or an uplift in the seabed. So that's one sign. So it's worth knowing that that's a potential sign of an incoming tsunami if you ever experience that.
In that area, yeah. Victoria, what were you going to ask Rebecca?
I have so many questions, Rebecca.
Oh, good.
But we've had reports as well of a volcanic eruption in the far east of Russia. Is there a known link between earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, or these kind of tectonic events?
Oh, I'm not aware of that, Victoria. That's news to me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wondered whether there was a direct link, or whether we can say that this activity in the Earth's crust is kind of tied together in any way.
Yeah, I mean, when these earthquakes happen, it just completely changes the stress field of the surrounding region.
What does that mean?
So on these subduction megathrust faults, between earthquakes, the plates are moving at centimetres per year, as I mentioned before, so the speed your fingernails grow. And all of that time, the force of that movement kind of builds up between the two plates. And once enough force is built up to overcome the friction between these plates, remember, they're blocks of rock kilometres thick, they're really heavy, there's lots of friction between them. But when enough force is built up, then they can suddenly slip. But they don't slip everywhere along that megathrust, they just slip in a patch. Even today's earthquake was 390 kilometres by 150 kilometres, I think, so it's just one patch. That changes the stress field on the fault around it. So if you've got a part of the fault that was nearly ready to go in an earthquake, but not quite, today's earthquake might have enhanced the stress, the force on that fault, meaning it could slip more quickly than it would have otherwise. Alternatively, the fault can also reduce the stress in some places too. So it can mean if there was a fault close to failure, close to slipping, it may now not fail for another decade or so. So it completely kind of changes the stress field. And people model that after earthquakes to try and assess, which faults could be a danger. The Turkey-Syria earthquakes, we saw one earthquake, then we saw that trigger a subsequent earthquake. So that was an example of this kind of stress triggering. Whether or not, that happens over very large distances, people are a little bit more skeptical about over what distances that stress can be transferred, and whether or not it could also, cause variations in volcanic events. I'm not sure, but certainly in terms of triggering other earthquakes, or meaning earthquakes may now happen a bit later than they would have otherwise. Right. That's certainly true.
I feel like we're turning your newscast, Adam, into an episode of Inside Science, which is
sorry.
It's great.
Happy to spread the love to other radio programs.
No, I'm in my element. Is there a danger as well of the seismometers that are nearest the event getting destroyed by the event?
Oh, that's a good question. Possibly. In 2018, I did a big experiment in New Zealand where we put out 200 seismometers to understand the subduction zone in New Zealand. That subduction zone is kind of interesting because it hasn't had any large earthquakes recently. So we're kind of wondering, is that because the next one is due in hundreds of years, or is stress being relieved in a different way? So we know that some subduction zones don't do this thing where they lock up for hundreds of years. They lock up for a little bit, maybe a few years, and then slip slowly. And these are called slow slip events. So we're trying to understand how slow slip events relate to, large earthquakes like the one we've seen today. So in 2018, we put out 200 seismometers to understand slow slip events. We took them all away in October of 2018, and then in December 2018 there was a big mud volcano eruption which would have completely covered a bunch of them. Oh, so wow. We certainly do see things, equipment damaged.
And I should just say, Victoria, Reuters are now quoting the Russian Academy of Sciences United Geophysical Service, saying that there has been a volcanic eruption. And in their statement, they said a descent of burning hot lava is observed on the western slope, powerful glow above the volcano, explosions. Wow. So I'm not sure how populated that area is. I imagine not very.
There's quite a lot of active volcanoes in that region. I was just sort of looking at a map of volcanic activity in that area, and there are quite a lot of active volcanoes all along hundreds of miles along that sort of fault line. So it's interesting, but it means that people in that area are still going to be on high alert. Although I think you're right, Adam, it's a very remote part of far eastern Russia. I don't think it is particularly densely populated.
And Victoria, I mean, it seems that around the world people are sort of standing down from where they were a couple of hours ago. It
seems like that, which is which is good news for the people who were in the path of this tsunami, and also shows that these warning systems are working well. Giving people a chance to get to higher ground and to get themselves safe. And I think it's something that we'll get a clearer picture of in the days and weeks of just, the more information that we can get from sensors in the ocean about how the water moved, about how that wave travelled, as well as seismometers about, how the Earth's crust was moving. We'll get a clearer picture of exactly what happened, how much movement, how quickly, how that wave dissipated, so that we can, build up a clear image of exactly what went on.
And talking about buildings, Rebecca, I mean, there's a vast gulf in the world between buildings that are built very well to withstand these very powerful forces in places like Japan, say, and places where they absolutely are not. For example, we saw in Turkey and Syria a couple of years ago.
Absolutely. And, a lot of that, I guess, has got to do with the economy and how much money that countries have. But also, it depends on, whether a country's experienced a large earthquake of that size. So in Japan, reasonably frequently, they have earthquakes of magnitude 8s, magnitude 9s. So there's a culture there that, investing in developing buildings is a really good thing to do. It's some subduction zones we haven't seen large earthquakes of that size. And, in those locations, we're not necessarily building buildings to withstand magnitude 8s or 9s. And that's something that, I'm really interested in researching, seeing if we can get to the bottom of what makes a subduction zone segment have a magnitude 9, and can we get closer to figuring out which subduction zones around the world that haven't seen magnitude 8.8s or 9s recently, but could be capable of it.
And does that mean we could have a sort of early warning system of the like we've got for tsunamis, because that happens sort of in slow motion, so you can have warnings? It would be great to have that for earthquakes, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question. That's the much more difficult problem. So tsunami waves in the ocean, they're fast, but they travel about as fast as a jet plane. So you've got the time it takes you to fly from eastern Russia to Hawaii to, prepare for it. Earthquake rupture is much, much faster. And yeah, it's much more difficult to get an early warning for that.
And Victoria, to end on a slightly existential note for you, hope you don't mind, but time to get poetic. But you realise covering stories like this, plate tectonics and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, they're the most powerful forces that we ever really come across, aren't they?
Yeah.
Everything else is quite minor in comparison.
Yeah, absolutely. It puts things in perspective, kind of seeing the literally seeing the impact of the Earth shift like this. But, it's interesting hearing what Rebecca was saying about, where we have urban populations, where people live close to these fault lines and how we can work out how they're going to behave. That's such interesting research. I'm sure there'll be more stories from that for us to pick up on. But I think there's a saying kind of among seismologists that it's not earthquakes that kill people, it's falling buildings. And there's this kind of gulf in the readiness, I suppose, for like urban environments to withstand that, because where you have kind of the most basic, smallest housing, like in the poorest areas, the collapse of a little mud hut is not really going to harm anybody. In places like urban centres in Japan, they have some incredibly clever architecture where these buildings can actually move on their foundations with the movement of the earth. And then in between, if you have kind of really hurried, not very carefully planned development, like some of the damage that we saw in the Myanmar earthquake earlier this year, you get a really terrible effect of that earthquake because of just the urban centre that it's hitting and the lack of preparedness for that. So although, there's not much sign of us being able to predict these events, certainly being able to design, plan, all of that into kind of urban planning and where people live and how people live, that has a real impact on keeping people safe.
Right, Victoria, thank you very much for your analysis today.
Thank you very much. An absolute pleasure to join you, Adam. Thanks.
And Dr. Bell, thanks to you too.
Thank you very much. Pleasure. Thanks.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. We will be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.